All right, let's dive in. Today, we're tackling how financial services firms are handling vulnerable customers. It's a hot topic, and we've got a lot to unpack from XCA reports to guidance from the industry itself, and even some real customer stories.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex area, but hopefully by the end of this deep dive, you'll not only understand the lay of the land, but also, be able to spot potential vulnerabilities and even advocate for yourself or others.
Exactly. So let's kick things off with the basics. How does the FCA, the UK's financial watchdog, actually define a vulnerable customer? It seems like there's a lot of room for interpretation there.
Well, you're right. It is a broad term. The SCA says it's someone who, due to their personal circumstances, is especially susceptible to detriment, particularly when a firm is not acting with appropriate levels of care.
Hmm. Susceptible to detriment. That's a pretty powerful phrase. So it's not just about being in a difficult situation. It's about how that situation might make you more vulnerable to, I guess, being taken advantage of by a financial service provider, right?
Exactly. And the thing is, vulnerability isn't a fixed state. It can be temporary,
Mhm.
something that comes and goes, and sometimes people might not even recognize it in themselves.
That makes a lot of sense when you think about it. I mean, so many situations could make someone vulnerable, right?
hmm
Sudden illness, job loss, having to care for a family member, even just starting to manage your own finances for the first time could be overwhelming.
Absolutely. All of those situations and countless others could apply. And that's why it's crucial for financial firms to understand that vulnerability is dynamic. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. They need systems in place that can identify and respond to all sorts of customer needs.
So let's talk about something we keep hearing about, the consumer duty. The FCA has been really emphasizing this, especially in relation to vulnerable customers. Can you break down what that is all about?
Sure. With the consumer duty coming into full force in 2023, the FCA is really raising the bar on how firms treat all their customers, but particularly those in vulnerable situations.
So leveling the playing field, making things fairer.
Yeah, you could say that. The consumer duty basically says that firms have to ensure good outcomes for all customers. That means their focus can't just be on profits. They actually have to consider the needs and potential vulnerabilities of their customers every step of the way.
Okay, that all sounds great on paper, but is it actually happening? I mean, from what I've seen in the FCA's own research, vulnerable customers are still reporting a lot of negative experiences with financial services, even more so than other customers.
You are right. There's definitely a gap there. And actually, I remember reading a quote from Sarah Pritchard, an executive director at the FCA. She said something like, "Those who disclose their needs tend to have better experiences."
So speaking up can make a difference.
It seems like it can. But here's the thing that blows my mind. The SEA found that only 4 out of 10 vulnerable customers actually tell their provider about their needs.
Wow, that's a shockingly low number. Why aren't people disclosing this stuff if it could help them?
Well, there are a few reasons for this, and they're all kind of intertwined. One of the biggest ones is just a lack of trust. You know, People worry about how firms will use their data, if they'll be treated differently, or even discriminated against if they reveal sensitive information.
Right, so it's that fear of judgment, maybe even being penalized just for being in a tough spot. I can see why people would hesitate to open up.
Absolutely. And there's another layer to it, too. Some people might not even recognize their own vulnerability. Or, they might be in denial about it. Maybe they're going through a temporary rough patch and just don't want to label themselves as vulnerable. It can be a tough term to swallow.
I get that. The word itself can feel pretty loaded. I have heard maybe using phrases like customers with additional needs instead to make it sound less, I don't know, less scary or stigmatizing. Do you think that could help?
It's an interesting approach. You have to consider how language impacts how people see themselves and how willing they are to ask for help. If a different term makes people feel safer opening up, that's a step in the right direction.
So, shifting gears a bit, given everything we've discussed, what are some concrete things that financial firms should be doing to better support these customers? Where do they need to step up their game?
Well, first of all, they can't just wait for customers to come to them. They need to be proactive, actively looking for signs of vulnerability, and reaching out to offer help.
So, no more assuming everyone is comfortable asking for help.
Exactly. They need to train their staff to recognize those signs and be equipped to have, real empathetic conversations with customers, no more robotic scripts. And they need to offer different ways for people to share their needs, not just relying on digital channels, because some people might feel more comfortable talking to someone face-to-face or over the phone.
Right. It's about making it as easy as possible for people to get the support they need. And they have to be upfront about how they're going to use and protect any data that customers share, right? That's a huge part of building trust.
Absolutely. Data privacy is paramount. And firms should also be thinking about partnering with specialist organizations who can provide expertise and support for customers with, more complex needs, like bringing in the A-team when needed.
I like that analogy. It's like, okay, that this is beyond our usual scope. Let's call in the experts. But while we're talking about what firms should be doing, what are some things they should definitely avoid? What are the red flags that might signal a firm isn't handling vulnerability well?
One of the biggest pitfalls is making assumptions about a customer's needs based on their age, what they look like, or any other superficial factor. Each person's situation is unique.
Right. So no stereotyping allowed.
Exactly. Another no-no is using overly complex language or jargon. If someone is already feeling overwhelmed, trying to decode financial terms is just going to add to their stress.
Makes sense. And they shouldn't be creating unnecessary barriers to getting help. If it's like pulling teeth just to get basic support, chances are people are going to give up.
You're right. Accessibility is key. They need to streamline processes and make it as easy as possible for people to get the help they need.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk directly to our listeners. What can you do to advocate for yourself or maybe someone you know when dealing with financial services?
The first thing is to know your rights. The consumer duty gives you real protection, so understand what those are. The SCA website is a great resource for that. Also, be prepared when you interact with these firms. Have any documentation that might be relevant ready to go, like medical records or proof of income, especially if it's connected to your specific situation.
Great tip. And I'd add, always keep notes of your interactions, particularly if something feels off or you're not getting the support you need. That way you have a record if you need to escalate things later.
Totally agree. Documentation is key. And don't be afraid to ask for clarification if something's not clear or if you feel like you're not being heard.
Absolutely. You have a right to clear and respectful communication. And remember, if you're ever unsure or just need more support, there are organizations out there that specialize in helping with these kinds of situations.
Speaking of which, later on we'll be talking about a firm called Compliance Consultant. They've got a ton of experience helping people navigate these exact issues.
And guess what? They're celebrating their 25th anniversary this year with a huge 25% discount on all their services. Plus, they got some pretty cool bonus offerings on top of that.
They really do a lot helping businesses with things like getting authorized by the FCA, conducting compliance audits, providing training, and offering advice on all things compliance.
And get this, they even have a compliance doctor persona, which I find kind of fun. It's like all your compliance worries gone.
Yeah.
They also have this fantastic testimonial on their website from a senior compliance officer who raved about their expertise and personalized service.
It seems like they have a proven track record, especially when it comes to helping firms support vulnerable customers. They can help develop strong policies, implement effective processes for identifying and supporting those customers, and make sure everything aligns with FCA guidelines and the consumer duty.
So if any financial firms out there are thinking, man, I need help with this stuff, check them out. You can find them online at complianceconsultant.org, email them at info@complianceconsultant.org, or if you're in the UK, give them a call at 0800-689-0190.
And if you want to schedule a call, no pressure or anything, they even have a direct booking link, bit.ly/discover. Just a chance to chat and see what they're all about.
Okay, so before we move on, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. How can WE, all of us, work together to make the financial services landscape more inclusive and supportive for everyone, no matter their situation? It's a big question, I know, but I think it's worth asking.
It is a big question. And it's one that requires all of us to think about how we can contribute to making financial services more accessible and fair for everyone. It's an ongoing journey, but progress is definitely being made.
Yeah.
I think it boils down to, a fundamental shift in how we view vulnerability. It's not a weakness, it's a shared human experience. We all go through times in our lives where we might need a bit of extra support, a bit more understanding, and that's okay.
Yeah, you're so right. And it makes me wonder, are there other industries out there, fields that have already tackled this kind of thing that financial services could learn from? Maybe areas where inclusivity and accessibility have already been front and center for a while.
Oh, absolutely. The disability rights movement, for instance, has made incredible progress in advocating for things like universal design principles. The idea is that products and services should be usable by as many people as possible, regardless of their abilities or limitations.
That's interesting. So applying that kind of thinking to financial services, we'd be talking about things like, I don't know, websites that are easy to use even if you have a visual impairment, or mobile apps with voice commands if you have difficulty typing, right?
Precisely. It's about anticipating a wide range of needs right from the start and
Yeah.
making sure that everyone can access and understand the information they need to make, sound financial decisions.
And that brings us back to something we were discussing earlier, the whole clear communication piece.
Hmm.
Financial jargon can be a real obstacle for anyone, but especially for someone who's already feeling stressed or vulnerable.
Couldn't agree more. Firms really need to ditch the technical terms and complicated legal language and just speak to customers in plain English. That's where staff training becomes so important, wouldn't you say?
Oh, for sure.
Frontline employees need the skills to not only recognize those potential vulnerabilities, but also to communicate in a way that's empathetic and easy to understand.
Yeah, I've seen some firms using things like visuals or infographics to explain, some of that more complicated financial stuff. And I think that's a really smart approach. Makes it so much easier to digest.
Visuals are super powerful, especially for people who are visual learners. And, even storytelling can be effective. Sharing real customer experiences while protecting privacy, of course, can really help illustrate how vulnerability shows up in different ways and how firms are stepping up to support those customers.
Yeah, I love that. Stories make these issues feel so much more real and relatable. It's not just about abstract rules and regulations, it's about people's lives.
Exactly. And if we can shift the narrative away from stigma and shame and toward, I guess, empathy and understanding, that's when we'll see a real transformation in how financial services are delivered and accessed.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about what firms should be doing, but what about the role of the regulator?
Well,
What can the FCA do to make sure firms are actually walking the walk, not just talking the talk?
I mean, they've already made some significant moves, like introducing the consumer duty and publishing all that guidance for firms on supporting vulnerable customers. But I think the key now is ongoing monitoring and enforcement, making sure firms are embedding those principles into their culture, not just treating it as a box-ticking exercise.
Right, so it's about holding firms accountable and making sure their actions match their words.
Absolutely. That might involve things like thematic reviews, where they take a deep dive into how firms are handling a specific issue, or even mystery shopping exercises.
Wait, hold on. Thematic reviews, mystery shopping, those sound interesting. Can you break those down a bit? What do those actually look like in practice?
Sure. So a thematic review is like a really focused investigation by the FCA. Let's say they want to look at how firms are identifying and supporting customers with mental health issues. They'll gather a ton of information from different firms, looking at their policies, procedures, training materials, maybe even interviewing staff and customers.
So it's a thorough investigation, not just a quick glance. What about mystery shopping? That sounds kind of cloak and dagger.
I know, right? But it can be a pretty effective way to see what's happening on the ground. They'll have someone pose as a regular customer, maybe with a specific vulnerability, and go through the process of interacting with a firm, like, opening an account or making a complaint. They report back on their experience and point out any good or bad practices they encounter.
That's fascinating. I bet that can be eye-opening for firms. It's one thing to have those nice policies on paper, but another to see how things actually play out in real life. So the FCA has that stick of enforcement if firms aren't playing by the rules, but are there any carrots? Do they ever highlight firms that are doing things exceptionally well?
Well, they do. And I think that's so important. Highlighting the good guys, the firms who are going above and beyond, can really inspire and motivate other firms to up their game too.
It's about creating that positive culture, encouraging everyone to strive for excellence. Now, something that really stood out to me in our research was this concept of sector-specific vulnerabilities. It seems like certain areas within financial services have higher concentrations of vulnerable customers than others. Why is that?
That's right. Research shows that, for example, around 27% of fund investors are considered vulnerable. And when you look at platform users, the vulnerability rate is around 28%, even higher for those on bank platforms.
Wow, those are some pretty significant numbers. Why do you think those rates are higher in those specific areas?
That's a great question, and one that needs more research. Could be related to the complexity of those financial products, or maybe the way they're marketed. Could also be tied to the demographics of those customer bases. Is it something that firms need to investigate further?
It really underscores the need for data, right? I mean, if firms are tracking vulnerability effectively, they should be able to spot those trends and be more proactive in addressing them.
Data is absolutely key. It's not just about collecting it, though. It's about using it to understand the scale and nature of vulnerability
Mm.
and also to measure the effectiveness of the support being provided, turning insights into action, making a real difference in people's lives.
Right. It's about using that data to drive meaningful change.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the importance of collaboration. You know, no single firm or even the regulator alone can solve this. It takes firms working together, sharing best practices, and learning from each other's experiences.
And of course, consumers need to feel empowered to speak up about their needs and know where to turn for help if they need it.
Exactly. It's about creating a system where everyone has a voice. A system where vulnerability isn't seen as something to be ashamed of, but as a shared human experience that deserves understanding and support.
That's a really great point. We've covered a lot today, from the FCA's definition of vulnerability to practical tips for both firms and consumers. But before we move on, I want to circle back to the disclosure dilemma. We know that a lot of vulnerable customers just aren't telling their providers about their needs. What can be done to encourage that open and honest communication?
It's a tough one, but I think it all comes down to building trust.
Trust that their information will be handled sensitively, trust that they won't be judged, and trust that speaking up will actually lead to a better experience.
Absolutely. And firms can build that trust through transparency, clear communication, and, demonstrating a real commitment to supporting those customers. Actions speak louder than words.
One thing that really resonated with me from our research was this idea that firms should be providing more opportunities for disclosure throughout the customer journey, not just making it a one-time thing.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Vulnerability can change, it can pop up at any time. So firms need to be asking the question regularly and making it easy for customers to update their information.
And using that information to actually tailor their products and services to meet those individual needs.
Exactly. Moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach and towards something much more personalized and responsive, treating people as individuals, not just numbers.
So let's say there's a financial firm listening to this right now thinking, okay, this is important, but where do we even start? What would be your number one piece of advice for them?
I'd say start by listening. Listen to your customers, listen to your employees, and listen to the experts who are working in this field. There's a lot of knowledge and resources out there.
And don't be afraid to experiment, right? I mean, what works for one firm might not work for another, so it's about finding what fits your customers and how you do business.
Exactly. And remember, this is a journey, not a destination. There's always more to learn, more we can do to create a truly inclusive and supportive financial system.
I love that. Now, I know we've already given compliance consultant a shout out, but I just want to emphasize that they can be an incredible resource for firms looking for support in this area.
Absolutely. Their expertise in FCA compliance and vulnerable customer support is top-notch, and they can help firms navigate those tricky regulations with confidence.
And don't forget that 25% discount for their 25th anniversary. Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to shift gears a bit and bring in some more real-world examples. Are there any specific cases, where firms are really getting this right? Things that stand out as best practices?
There are actually quite a few. One example that really impressed me came from the SCA's review of good and poor practices. One firm, I can't recall the name right now, stood out for their work with customers who were experiencing mental health challenges. They went above and beyond and partnered with a mental health charity to train their staff.
So they didn't just rely on internal training, they brought in outside experts who really understood the nuances of those needs.
Exactly. The training covered everything from recognizing the signs of distress to communicating in a sensitive and supportive way. It's about building that empathy and understanding.
That makes so much sense. What other cool things were they doing?
Well, they implemented something called a tell us once policy. Basically, a customer only had to disclose their mental health condition once, and then that information was securely shared with other departments within the firm.
Oh, wow, that's brilliant. So no more having to repeat your story over and over again, which can be so emotionally draining, especially if you're already feeling vulnerable. It streamlines the process and puts the customer first.
You got it. It's a
Yeah.
simple change, but it makes a huge difference.
Okay, so we've heard about the good. What about the not so good? Any cautionary tales, things firms should definitely avoid doing?
Unfortunately, yes. The SCA's review also highlighted some, well, less than ideal practices. One firm was called out for making assumptions about customers' financial capability based only on their age. Some older customers were being excluded from certain products or services just because of how old they were.
That's just wrong. It goes to show why it's so important to treat every customer as an individual, not a stereotype.
Absolutely. Another firm got in trouble for using overly complicated language in communications with customers who were in debt. You can imagine how frustrating and confusing that must have been for someone already struggling.
Yeah, not helpful at all. So it's clear there's still work to be done, but at least the FCA is shining a light on both the good and the bad.
For sure. That increased scrutiny is pushing the industry forward, and I think the consumer duty is also having a positive impact in terms of setting higher expectations for how firms treat their customers.
So looking ahead, what do you think the future holds for vulnerable customer support? What trends are you seeing, and what challenges still need to be tackled?
Well, one trend that's gaining momentum is the use of technology, specifically AI, to identify and support these customers. Some firms are exploring how AI can analyze customer data and flag potential vulnerabilities.
AI. Huh. That's interesting, but also a bit, I don't know, concerning. We've all heard stories about AI bias, right?
Mhm.
How can we be sure it's used ethically and responsibly?
That's a great point, and one that needs careful consideration. Those algorithms need to be designed and trained fairly, and there needs to be human oversight, making sure the technology isn't making harmful decisions.
So keeping humans in the loop is essential. We can't just hand over everything to machines and hope for the
I
best.
agree. We need to be thoughtful and careful about how we integrate AI.
What about financial education? It seems like equipping people with the knowledge and skills to manage their finances could help build resilience and, potentially reduce vulnerability in the long run.
Absolutely. Financial literacy is crucial, and it needs to start early. Teaching children and young people about budgeting, saving, debt, just the basics of how money works.
And that education needs to be adaptable, tailored to different needs and learning styles. Not everyone learns the same way.
Exactly. We need to get creative and think outside the box. Explore online resources, interactive tools, even gamification. Make financial education more engaging and accessible.
And let's not forget about those who might not be as tech savvy, who might need more support with online banking and digital financial services.
For sure, it's about meeting people where they are and providing the right kind of support at the right time, recognizing that everyone has different needs and learning styles.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into vulnerable customer support, what's the main takeaway you want listeners to remember?
I'd say it's this. Vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's part of the human experience. We all have the potential to be vulnerable at some point, and it's our job to create a financial system that's inclusive, supportive, and fair for everyone.
I love that. And that's the perfect segue to our final part. When we come back, we'll be exploring even more real-world examples and looking at what the future holds for vulnerable customer support. Stay tuned. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into vulnerable customer support. Before break, we were talking about real-world examples, actually seeing how these principles are being put into practice. And you mentioned some really positive cases. What else stuck with you?
Well, I was really impressed with how some firms are simplifying their communication, particularly for customers struggling with debt. One firm I read about actually completely redesigned their debt collection letters, ditching the legal jargon and using really clear and empathetic language instead. And get this, they even added visuals like charts and graphs.
So it's about making the information easy to understand, right? Not just about being sensitive, but actually making sure people can grasp what's going on.
Exactly. And, speaking of communication, I've also seen some interesting approaches to how firms are reaching out to these customers in the first place.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, some are partnering with local community organizations, like charities or support groups, to spread the word about the help they offer. It's a great way to reach people who might not otherwise come forward.
I see. So it's about building trust by working with organizations that people already know and rely on. Makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And then there are firms experimenting with things like videos or even podcasts to explain complex topics in a more engaging way. They're realizing that traditional written communication, like letters or emails, doesn't always cut it.
It makes you wonder if this focus on vulnerable customers is actually pushing firms to be more innovative and customer-focused overall, right? Could this be a good thing for everyone, not just those who are considered vulnerable?
I think so. It's a real opportunity for them to rethink how they do things and create a better experience for all their customers.
A rising tide lifts all boats, right? But let's be realistic for a minute. There are still going to be challenges and bumps along the road. What are some of the things that worry you? What are the potential roadblocks?
Well, one thing is consistency. Right now it's kind of a mixed bag. Some firms are doing amazing work, but others are still lagging behind. The FCA guidance is helpful, but there's still a lot of variation in how firms interpret and implement it.
So how do we get everyone on the same page?
It's going to take a multi-pronged approach. Continued pressure from the FCA, more collaboration between firms, and, honestly, more consumer awareness and advocacy. When customers demand better treatment, firms have to listen.
So it goes back to that collective effort we talked about before. We all have a role to play in making this happen. Okay, before we wrap up, I want to go back to AI. I'm still a bit unsure about it. How can we make sure AI is used ethically and responsibly in this context? How do we avoid unintended consequences?
It's a huge question, and there's no easy answer. But one thing is for sure. We need to make sure the data used to train these systems is diverse and truly representative. Otherwise, AI could end up perpetuating biases, which would defeat the whole purpose.
Right, so it's about being mindful of the data that's feeding the system and being aware of potential biases.
Absolutely. And transparency is crucial. Firms need to be open about how they're using AI, what data they're collecting, and how those algorithms are working.
So transparency and accountability, those are essential. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about everything from the consumer duty to the potential of AI and the importance of financial education. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I want them to remember that supporting vulnerable customers isn't just the right thing to do. It's also good business. When firms prioritize the needs of all their customers, including the most vulnerable, everyone benefits. We create a stronger, more resilient, and ultimately fairer financial system.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's a fantastic note to end on. A huge thank you to our guests for sharing their expertise and to all of you for listening. We'll be back next week with a whole new topic, but until then, stay curious and remember, we all have the power to make a difference.